The first time I saw her, the air was thick with heat, and the boards under my boots gave a low groan with every step. She was in the far stall, knees drawn tight, one wrist chained above her head to a post darkened with sweat and dust. The light slanted through a broken window, laying strips of gold across her torn burgundy dress. She didn't call out, didn't even move. Just fixed her eyes on the open doorway, as if willing someone to walk through it. Outside, a dry wind rattled the warped shutters, and somewhere beyond the corral, a horse stamped once impatient. I hadn't decided yet whether to keep walking or find out why she was there. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything. I'm Colt Renner. I've run cattle on my spread west of Red Mesa, going on 15 years now, the last 5 of them alone. I was raised back in Missouri, where my folks taught me early that a man's worth came from his word and the work he put in from sunup to sundown. My father believed in shaking a neighbor's hand before talking business, and my mother kept the Sabbath the way she kept her table with care and a sense of duty. We lived lean the way most farm families did, mending what could be fixed, selling off what we didn't truly need. That way of living stayed with me even after I traded green hills for dry mesas and fence posts. Out here, coin talks louder than most men's promises. Since the railroad came through, the town's been crawling with land agents and speculators, men who'll look you in the eye while they measure what they can take. Stores sit stocked with things we never saw back home, priced high for the folks who've struck silver or made a deal with the rail. I've kept to myself for the most part, riding in for feed and nails, leaving before the whiskey loosens anyone's tongue. Quiet suited me fine, until that day at the stage stop. It was the kind of place most riders avoided, roof sagging and the middle sign hanging by one rusted chain, no fresh wagon tracks in sight. I'd only meant to water my horse and get back on the trail. But I stepped inside and saw Cobb, the station master, red-faced and slumped behind his desk, a bottle hanging loose in his hand. Beside him leaned Boone, young, restless eyes fixed on the woman in the stall. Something in that stillness between them told me more than words could. The air felt heavy, and the only sound was the creak of the building settling in the heat. I didn't ask her name. Not then. I just let my eyes take in the chain, the bruises, the way she kept her back pressed to the beam, as if bracing for whatever might come next. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't riding out as quickly as I'd planned. Somewhere outside, a single set of hoofbeats broke the quiet, slow and steady, drawing closer to the door. Raymond Cobb sat half-slouched behind his desk, a haze of stale whiskey hanging in the air between us. His shirt was marked down the front, his cheeks flushed deep as brick. The sound of my boots on those warped boards stirred him enough to open his eyes, but not enough to clear them. Across the room, Elias Boone leaned on the gate of the far stall. He was young, with slicked hair and boots too big for his feet, but his eyes stayed fixed in a way that made the space between heartbeats feel too long. Delaney was there, pressed back against a post, her left wrist shackled high, the chain sunk into the wood. The heat had left a sheen across her skin, and the burgundy dress she wore clung in dark patches. One sleeve was torn away, the skirt hung uneven threads curling loose where the fabric had given. Her eyes found mine, but she didn't move, didn't speak. I could see the marks on her arms where the rope or hands had been before the iron. Cobb muttered something about fees and water, his words tumbling together. I didn't answer. My boots carried me toward the stall, without hurry, without turning my gaze from her. Boone shifted his weight, leaning in with a low voice. "She's not for sale," he said. I stopped just short of the gate, looked at him once, and he stepped back like he'd remembered something better to do. I took in the chain, the way her fingers trembled from holding that one position. Too long, the bruises fading at the edges, but still dark in the middle. No words passed between us. I turned, stepped out through the doorway into the glare of the yard. My horse flicked its tail at a fly. The breeze out here carried the smell of dust and sun-warmed leather. When I came back, I was carrying the shotgun from my wagon. Cobb blinked at it, squinting against the lamplight. "She agreed to stay," he mumbled. "Earned her keep." I let a coin pouch fall to the desk. It hit with enough weight to rattle the inkwell. "Unlock it," I said. My voice stayed low. Boone's mouth tightened, but he stayed where he was. Cobb swore under his breath, reached for a ring of keys, and tossed it to the floor. The metal clattered once, skidded toward the stall. I crouched beside her, turned the key in the lock. The cuff opened, and her arm fell to her lap. She flexed her fingers once, slow. I stepped back toward the doorway. She didn't move right away. The chain settled in the straw behind her, and for a breath, the only sound was the groan of a loose board under my heel. She rose unsteadily, gathering the torn fabric around her, and followed me into the white light outside. We didn't speak during the first mile. The wagon wheels found their own rhythm in the ruts, the creak of the frame carrying farther than our voices would have. She sat in the back knees, drawn up, one bare foot tucked under the other leg. Her eyes stayed on the horizon. I kept one hand on the reins, the other near the rifle resting by the seat. The land stretched flat, a thin line of mesquite breaking the orange glare where the sun bent low. The air still held the day's heat, though the shadow of evening was starting to reach across the ground. Once we crossed the dry bed of a shallow creek, I heard the scrape of her shifting closer to the wagon's sideboard. She looked out over the empty ground, then down, and stayed quiet. By the time we reached the rise above my place, the light was thinning into that short blue before night. The cabin sat close to the bluff, a narrow creek slipping behind it. The corral fence held my buckskin mare. Her ears pricked toward the sound of our wheels. No other roofs in sight, no chimney smoke but my own. I climbed down, unlatched the wagon's side. She stayed seated a moment longer, then eased herself to the ground. Her knees bent like she was still feeling the pull of the chain. Inside, I lit the lamp on the table. The room was plain. A stove with a stack of split wood beside it, one cot, a table, and 2 chairs. A shelf with a tin cup and some shirts folded on the end. She stopped just inside the door, the hem of her skirt brushing the floor. "Why'd you do it?" Her voice was thin, rasped from thirst. I set another log in the stove before answering. "Didn't like the way they looked at you." "You could have kept riding," she said. I nodded once. "I could have." She stepped forward, eyes on the quilt folded over the chair. "I don't have anything to give you." I met her gaze. I didn't ask. I laid the quilt by the hearth, spread it flat, and walked past her to tend the mare. When I came back, she was lying under the blanket, her head turned toward the fire. I took the chair across from her. After a long while, she whispered, "Hold me. Use me. Just get me out of here." Her eyes stayed on the flames. I pulled another quilt from the cot, laid it over her. "You're out," I said. "That's enough for tonight." Her breathing evened out after that. The room settled into the small sounds of the stove ticking as the heat shifted. She was still asleep when I rose in the gray light before dawn. I stepped outside to split kindling. The air was cooler, the smell of the creek running just past the bluff, carrying in the breeze. When I came back in, she was sitting up holding the quilt around her shoulders. Her eyes followed me as I set the axe by the door. "You should eat," I said. She nodded and took the chair at the table. I ladled beans into a tin plate, poured coffee into a cup, and set them in front of her. She ate slow at first, then quicker. When she finished, she washed the plate without being told. I asked her name. "Delaney," she said. I didn't ask for more. By afternoon, she was stacking kindling beside the stove. I noticed she favored her left wrist, the skin still marked where the iron had been. When the sun dropped low, I laid the quilt out for her again, but she said I can sleep on the porch or the barn. I shook my head. "It's yours now." That night the wind came in hard from the west. I woke to the sound of it against the shutters and found her standing by the cot. "Can I sit here a minute?" I moved over. She sat knees drawn up, and after a while her hand found mine. Her head rested against my shoulder, and we stayed that way until the fire burned down low. The next morning, the sky had the look of weather building far out over the mesas. I knew something was shifting, though the air in the room stayed still. By the fourth morning, the marks on Delaney's wrists had begun to fade from deep purple to a muted yellow, though she still moved her arm with care. She rose before the sun cleared the bluff, padding quietly across the cabin to sweep the floor and set water on the stove. I came in from the corral to find her pouring coffee into 2 tin cups, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth torn from the hem of that ruined dress. She said nothing, just slid 1 cup toward me and went back to the stove. I spent most of the day mending a fence line south of the creek. She followed with a bundle of cut stakes under one arm, her other hand gripping a hammer that looked heavy for her frame. When the ground grew uneven, I took the hammer from her without a word and passed her a lighter tool. She set each stake straight, tamping the soil with her boot until the wood held firm. The sun climbed high, warming the back of my neck, and I saw her push the sleeves of my old flannel past her elbows. Inside that evening, she found a small tin on the shelf and laid it open on the table. Needles, buttons, and bits of cloth spilled out. By lamplight, she took up one of my shirts and began altering the sides, pulling the fabric in so it hung closer to her frame. I worked the whetstone across my knife, the scrape of steel carrying steady between us. She kept her head down, her fingers moving with the kind of skill that came from years at a sewing bench. By week's end, she had taken her place at the table beside me instead of waiting until I finished. She asked quiet questions now where I'd been. Before Red Mesa, if I ever took cattle farther north, whether the mare in the corral had a name. I answered what I could, letting the rest fall to silence. That night, after the plates were washed, she lowered herself to the floor by the fire, the quilt drawn around her legs. "I'm not much use," she said. I set the knife aside. "You fix things." It was the plain truth. Wind came up after midnight, dry and sharp whistling under the eaves. I woke to the sound of it and found her standing near the cot, the quilt hanging from her shoulders. "Can I sit here a while?" she asked. I shifted over. She perched on the edge, then slid closer until her arm touched mine. Her hand found its way to my palm, her fingers cold from the draft. She leaned her head to my shoulder, and we stayed that way until the wind began to fade. The next day carried a high, clear sky, but the air kept a cool bite. She came with me to check the tack room, running her hands over the bridles to find worn stitching. At the corral, I handed her the lead rope. The mare stepped forward to her without hesitation. "You've worked horses before," I said. "My brother kept 2, she replied, smoothing a hand along the mare's neck. She met my eyes once, then glanced back to the animal. We cleaned stalls until midday, pausing only to drink from the tin cups she had set on the rail. Dust clung to her cheeks, and a loose strand of hair caught at the corner of her mouth. She brushed it away with the back of her wrist and went on with the work. When the sun dropped low, we sat on the porch steps, her knees drawn up, the hem of my shirt falling just above them. She spoke of a city she'd once wanted to see and a shop she'd dreamed of keeping. I listened, watching the light slip behind the ridge. That night, as the fire settled into a low glow, she asked if she still needed to keep her bedroll by the hearth. I told her she could choose. She came to the cot without hesitation, settling at my side with her head against my chest. My arm lay loosely around her shoulders, and for a long while we said nothing. Outside, the breeze moved through the grass like water, and I felt her breathing slow in time with it. By morning, the first sign of weather change showed on the horizon, a pale haze where the mesas met the sky. She stepped out to the porch with her coffee-bare feet against the worn boards, watching it the way folks do when they've lived through too many storms to take one lightly. Something in the air told me this stretch of quiet wouldn't last. The next few days found a steady rhythm. Delaney rose before the light, moving quietly around the cabin to sweep the floor and stoke the stove. She had taken to wearing that altered flannel shirt over what remained of her dress, the sleeves rolled past her elbows. I would step in from the corral to the smell of coffee, the tin cups already set out on the table. We didn't speak much in the mornings, but the silence wasn't strained. When we worked outside, she followed without being told, carrying what she could. If a bundle was too heavy, I'd hand her a smaller one and keep moving. She never complained, never asked to stop. One afternoon, while I repaired a gate hinge, she stacked the split rails in a neat row without me saying how. By the time we went inside, the last of the sunset had turned the bluff behind the cabin the color of rust. That evening, she found the tobacco tin again and sat by the lamplight, sewing with her head bent low. This time, she was working on the shirt she'd been wearing, adding a second hem to the neckline so it would stay in place. Her fingers were quick, her stitches even. I sat across from her mending a bridle strap, and we worked without talk until the fire burned low. The wind picked up just after midnight. It rattled the shutters and set a dry whistle under the roof. I woke to find her standing near the cot, and her quilt draped over one shoulder. She didn't ask this time, just sat beside me. I shifted over and she leaned into my side. Her hand found mine under the blanket, her fingers curling around my palm. We stayed like that until the wind eased. By morning, the air had turned sharp, carrying the scent of rain from somewhere far off. She followed me to the corral, and I handed her the lead rope. The mare stepped forward at her soft click, pressing her nose to Delaney's arm. "You've handled horses before," I said. She nodded once. "My brother kept two." She stroked the mare's neck, her touch slow and steady. The day passed with small tasks, sweeping out the tack room, brushing dust from the saddles, carrying buckets from the creek. Around midday, we rested on the porch steps, the boards warm under our boots. She told me she had once planned to open a dry goods shop in Kansas City. Her eyes stayed on the ridge as she spoke, her voice low. I listened, the breeze moving between us without breaking the quiet. That night, she came to the cot without hesitation. She lay close, her head resting against my chest, her breath evening out as the fire settled into embers. My arm stayed around her, not holding her down, just keeping her near. Outside, the grass whispered in the dark, and the air felt like it was waiting for something. The weather turned in the night, a restless wind rolling over the bluff and finding its way under the shutters. By sundown the next day, the air was thick with dust, the sky holding that low, unsettled light storms carry. I barred the door and checked the latch on the window near the stove. Delaney stood by the hearth, her arms folded, the altered flannel loose over her frame. Her shoulders were tight, her gaze steady on the flames, but I could tell the noise in the wind was bringing old thoughts she didn't want. "You all right?" I asked. She nodded without looking at me. After a moment, she stepped forward, closing the space until the firelight stretched between us. "I don't want to be alone tonight," she said. I told her she wasn't. She shook her head slightly. "Not that kind of alone. I want to be touched by someone who won't hurt me." Her voice was quiet but certain. I set the tin cup I'd been holding on the table and stood. She came to me first, her hands finding the buttons of my shirt. She worked them one by one, her eyes on mine, watching for hesitation. I had none. When my hands rested at her waist, I kept them still until she leaned closer. Her lips found mine in a slow, sure kiss, and I felt the tension in her shoulders ease under my touch. When I lifted her, her legs drew around my hips without breaking the moment. The cot was close. I set her down gently, settling beside her, instead of over her. She drew my shirt from my shoulders, and I paused, meeting her eyes once more to be certain. Her hand covered mine. "Don't stop," she whispered. We moved together without hurry, each breath measured, each touch deliberate. Her fingers pressed into my back, mine traced the line of her ribs with care. The past didn't vanish in that moment, but it stepped aside enough for her to be here with me without fear. When I eased into her fully, she drew in a sharp breath, her eyes closing as her body welcomed mine. I held the back of her head, my other hand firm at her hip, finding a rhythm that was steady, patient. When she spoke my name almost undone, I slowed, drawing her closer. After we stayed in the warmth of the quilt, her cheek resting against my chest. She traced the old scar under my ribs with the tip of her finger. "That didn't feel like just surviving," she murmured. "It wasn't," I said. She was quiet for a long time before asking, "Will you send me away someday?" I kept my eyes on the low ceiling. "No, I don't take people in just to let them go." She shifted, looking up at me. "You've been alone a long time." I nodded, got used to it. "Doesn't mean I liked it." She settled back down. "You don't know everything about me," she said softly. "You didn't ask what I did before I answered, or who I've had to kill, or why I came out here." She drew a slow breath. "You could have turned around that day. You could have walked away." I said only I didn't. Outside, the wind began to lose its edge, the worst of the storm passing. In the stillness that followed, something else shifted. She no longer felt like a guest in my cabin or a soul I'd pulled from danger. She belonged here in a way we hadn't named yet. She drifted to sleep against me, not from exhaustion this time, but from knowing she could. Dawn came soft, a pale light through the cracks in the shutters. She woke still beside me, stretching slowly before pulling the quilt around her shoulders. I stirred the fire while she moved about the room, the hem of my shirt brushing her thighs. We worked around each other easily without the awkwardness of the early days. After breakfast, I asked if she wanted to help check the saddle girths. She pulled on her moccasins and followed me to the barn without hesitation. The mare paced in the corral, tossing her head. Delaney stepped to the rail, clicked her tongue, and the horse came to her at once. "You could learn to ride," I said. She looked at me. "Would you teach me?" I told her if she stayed, she might as well know how to move fast when she needed to. She glanced down at the dust near her feet. "I don't plan on leaving." We spent the morning cleaning tack and sweeping the stalls. She carried the smaller feed buckets without being told, her movements already fitting into the pattern of the work. By midday, we rested on the porch steps, the sun warm on our backs. She asked about my time as a scout during the war, whether I'd ever gone back east. I told her I had no reason to, that everything I had was buried out here. She nodded, looking toward the bluff. That evening, while I stirred a pot over the fire, she stepped closer. "Do you still want me to sleep by the hearth tonight?" she asked. I shook my head. "Only if you want to." She didn't. She came to the cot and settled against me as if she had always been there. In the quiet that followed, she asked, "Why did you really come to that station?" I kept my thumb moving slow along her back. "I needed feed and water," I said. She smiled faintly. "You didn't go looking for me?" "No. But once I saw you, I knew I wasn't leaving without you." She searched my face. Why, I told her, "Because you looked at me like I was a man, not a threat, not a savior, just someone who could help." Her lips found mine in a soft, unhurried kiss. When she pulled back, she whispered, "I don't want to survive anymore. I want to live." I drew the quilt over us as the fire settled to embers, knowing the days ahead would test whatever we had just begun. Spring pushed in slow, the kind that softened the ground just enough for a shovel to bite. I started turning soil behind the cabin, a narrow strip near the creek where the morning light fell first. Delaney came out with a tin of seed in her hands, resting it against her hip while I worked the row. She moved with more steadiness, now her steps sure on the uneven ground. Inside, her sewing had shifted to smaller pieces, scraps of muslin and soft cotton folded neat in a basket by the hearth. One evening she held up a tiny bonnet, the ties dangling loose, and laid it carefully on the table. We didn't speak about it much. The work said enough. A trip to town came late in April. I needed nails, she wanted more thread and coarse cloth. The streets were busier than I liked. Wagons lined along the main road, the air sharp with coal smoke from the blacksmith's forge. In the feed store, eyes followed us. A man near the counter muttered something under his breath about ranchers and strays. I turned to him, said, "She's my wife," without raising my voice. The room went still long enough for the point to hold. We left without delay, the wagon rolling east toward the bluff as the sun fell low. Back at the cabin, she unpacked supplies while I watered the mare. When I stepped inside, she was watching me from the table. I nodded toward the chair. "Sit down." She did, her hands folding in her lap. I knelt and took a small silver band from my coat pocket, plain and smooth. "Didn't figure I'd do this again," I told her. "But you changed that." She didn't hide the tears when she said yes. I slid the ring onto her finger. It was a touch loose, but she didn't care. That night, she slept with her head on my chest, my arms around her, the air warm with the scent of wood smoke in her hair. By mid-May, the new room was nearly done. The pine boards were still raw, but the frame was tight, and the window faced east like I'd planned. A hand-carved cradle sat in the corner, the wood sanded smooth. One morning she stood on the porch in my shirt, one hand resting over the swell of her belly, watching the grass move in the breeze. I stepped up behind her, wrapping my arms across her shoulders. Neither of us spoke. The quiet we shared wasn't empty. It was the kind you build when nothing has to be said. By late May, the new room was finished. The pine walls still held the sharp scent of fresh-cut wood, and the east window caught the early sun in a soft wash across the floor. The cradle sat in the corner, its curved runners smooth from my knife. A thin quilt folded inside. Delaney spent the morning sewing at the table, her belly round beneath my shirt, her hands steady over each seam. That week, we rode to town again. Supplies were running low, and she wanted muslin for more baby clothes. The main street was warm with late spring sun, the dust stirred by passing wagons. Folks looked our way, some nodding, others letting their eyes linger too long. She kept her chin level, her hand brushing against mine as we stepped inside the mercantile. The storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Kellen, came from behind the counter with a measuring tape. She asked after the baby and set out bolts of cloth for Delaney to choose from. Across the room, two men leaned against the wall, speaking low. I caught my name and a word I didn't care for. I turned to face them. "Something you need to say, you can say it plain." They said nothing after that. We left with the cloth wrapped tight under her arm, the weight of their stares left behind in the dust. The ride home was quiet except for the sound of leather and hooves. Back at the cabin, I carried in the nails and lamp oil while she laid out the cloth on the table. When I came back inside, she was watching me. "You didn't have to say anything in there," she murmured. I told her it wasn't about having to. It was about making sure they knew where we stood. She smiled faintly and bent to her work. Evenings were longer now, the light holding past supper. We'd sit on the porch while the sky turned, her chair drawn close to mine, her feet resting on the rail. She talked sometimes about the first weeks here, how she'd kept her bag packed in her head in case she had to leave. I listened, knowing she no longer spoke of leaving as anything more than a shadow. One night after she set her sewing aside, she came to stand behind my chair, her hands resting on my shoulders. "You've given me more than a place to stay," she said. I covered her hands with mine and told her she'd given this place something it hadn't had in a long time, a reason to feel lived in. The next morning broke clear, the grass along the bluff moving in a light wind. I was in the corral checking the rail posts when I heard hoofbeats on the hard ground beyond the ridge. Not the sound of a neighbor's gelding on a slow pass. These were quicker, more deliberate. By the time I stepped to the gate, a rider was coming into view, a small trail of dust curling up behind. The rider pulled up at the edge of the yard, dust settling around his boots as he swung down. It was Sheriff McClary, his hat low against the morning glare. He tied his reins to the porch rail, the leather creaking under his hand. "I came straight from town," he said. "Circuit judge arrived yesterday. He's ready to hear the matter." His eyes moved to Delaney, standing just inside the doorway, one hand resting on the frame. We saddled up before noon, riding the 12 miles into town. The air was warm, the sky wide and cloudless. Folks turned to watch as we passed, some tipping their hats, others keeping their faces set. At the courthouse, the judge sat at a table, the sheriff beside him, and a few townspeople lined along the back wall. He read the findings slowly, each word carrying weight in the still room. The claims against Delaney were struck down, the land she'd been cheated from restored in her name. The men who tried to force her out were ordered to pay damages, their false witness laid bare in front of all. Delaney's shoulders eased as the words sank in. She didn't speak, just gave the smallest nod toward the judge. Outside, the afternoon sun hit us full, and the scent of lilacs from the edge of town drifted on the breeze. We stayed in town long enough to buy a sack of flowers, some coffee, and a tin of peppermint drops she liked. Then we rode back the long trail home, feeling different under our horses' hooves. At the cabin, she paused on the porch, looking out over the land. "This is ours," she said quietly. I knew she didn't just mean the deed in her hand. She meant the safety, the steadiness, the right to stay without fear. That night, after the lamps were turned down, I sat for a while on the porch. The stars were sharp above the dark hills, and the air was cool on my skin. Inside, I could hear her moving the faint rustle of cloth as she settled. Life on the frontier doesn't hand you much without a fight. But sometimes, if you stand your ground long enough, you get to keep the things that matter. And if you're lucky, you find someone worth keeping them with. If you've walked your own hard trail or known someone who has, maybe you'll share this with them. Maybe it'll remind them there's still good to be held on to out here.